This is the Sales Babble Podcast, episode 322, Defending SDRs, an interview with Nikki Ivey.
Welcome to Sales Babble, the podcast that shares selling secrets for non-sellers. And now your host, Pat Helmers.
Hello, Sales Babblers. This is Pat Helmers, and I hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend if you're here in the United States. I'm still on vacation, so I'm going to make this brief. Our guest is Nikki Ivey, and she is a member of the SDR Defenders. She's an advocate for sales development reps, and today she shares strategies and tactics for business development, old habits we need to stop, and new areas where we should focus our energy. And so, with no further ado, let's get to it. Welcome, Nikki. Are you ready to babble?
I'm ready.
Awesome. Nikki, I know a guy who is familiar with the SDR Defenders, of which you're a member, right?
That is correct. A proud wearer of the SDR Defenders cape, carrier of the mantle. Yes.
He pointed me towards that website. I went and looked on it, and I started reading it, and I started reading all about all the things that you believe in for SDRs being sales development reps. And I was so excited to see that you were on there, and I reached out to you, and you was more than happy to come and visit the podcast, and I so appreciate that. So, what is your superpower, Nikki?
Ooh, I love this question. I think I am super intuitive when it comes to how people are feeling, and it gives me the ability, whether it's, in person or online or in just an audio like this, to make connections quicker, I'd say, than the average human, quicker than the average rep. You threw me off guard. I'm not used to talking about myself like that. Like, I'm so good at connecting people. People like me so much. But it's true.
This is an interview of you, so you are going to have to open up to a certain because they don't want to hear about me. They know all about me. They've heard more than enough about Pat. But we want to learn about Nikki and what your superpower is. And do you think of yourself as you have high EQ?
That's it. I have a high EQ. It's really buzzy today to be talking about, being empathetic and, leading with that. And, that's something that for me, I actually had to work to scale back in order to function and sort of sustain myself in a healthy way in a sales career. Because what can happen is, I'm caring too much in one direction about, folks I'm working alongside and folks that I'm working to help or support through the service I'm selling. And then it leaves very little care for myself. So, so empathy, it's a double-edged sword if it comes naturally to you. But I've certainly been able to leverage it as a superpower in my career, for sure.
I love that. Because I think empathy is really important. But again, like you say, it's all about balance. But I'm getting off track here because you are a member of the SDR Defenders. Why do SDRs need defending?
SDRs need defending because at world-class organizations, these are the folks that are on average responsible for generating 60% of the pipeline at those organizations. And yet they tend to be culturally within a sales org, the folks who get the least respect, frankly. And the conversations around, how that role will evolve, what the compensation should be, and things that affect people's actual lives. If you look at, how that conversation is playing out online, on social, particularly on LinkedIn, and such spaces, SDRs, BDRs are not included in that conversation the way they should be. They're not the ones leading the conversation, leading what the culture should be like for folks who do that work day in and day out. And so this is not a touchy-feely, these are all my little babies and I want to hug them endeavor, although I do heart hugs. What it in fact is, is it I think a much needed and much delayed, like much overdue, uh, just taking a stand on like, look, these are the people who are contributing pipeline. These are the people who deserve to have more respect and more of a voice in the larger sales culture.
So to make sure we get our definitions correct, what exactly is an SDR? And I've also heard the term BDR, LDR. What are these things? Who are these people?
These people are sales development reps. And the acronyms can get pretty involved. And at some organizations, yes, there's a difference, right? So at some organizations, for instance, the sales development reps are outbound, and the business development reps or BDRs are inbound. There's also ISRs who do a full cycle, but they're still working on inbound leads. And so, there can be a lot of nuance between what those terms mean, but ultimately, when I speak about SDRs and when we speak about our mission at SDR Defenders, we're talking about any sales professional who is in an entry level or prospecting position where the primary function of the role is to make outbound calls and make connections that tend to be the initial or discovery conversations with buyers at that organization. So when I say it, that's what I mean. But yeah, there are nuances, and I've actually carried more than one of those titles. I was an MDR, market development rep, but it functioned a lot like the sales development rep role at all, and they all need support.
Yeah, like LDR, lead development rep, same idea. Always.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that one. You hit me with a new one today. I hadn't heard that one, but now I'll know what it means when I see it.
Turn those leads into opportunities. That's
right.
goal. So, which is actually a very hard part of this, which I actually believe the hardest part of the sale is to get that initial sales meeting, that initial conversation where you can really do some discovery on what their issues are, what their problems, desires are, and then maybe share a little bit about your product or service. That's really, really hard. Closing is hard too. That's the other second part. But getting the meetings even more important, because if you don't get a meeting, you can't close them. So why is it, do you think, what's going on here? Why aren't these people who are doing, in my mind, the hardest part of sales, why don't they get no respect?
I love that you asked me that question. And I want to be clear that I don't believe that the reason is any conscious or overt, not widespread anyway. I mean, I'm sure on some sales floors that is absolutely the case, but profession wide, industry wide, I don't believe that there is, an agenda to, disrespect or put upon folks in that role. What I think is happening is there is this perception, because it tends to be entry level, and because a lot of the folks who come into an organization in that role tend to be, new college grads or folks that don't have express experience in SaaS or in B2B revenue. I think that
SaaS, you mean software as a service?
Exactly. And so I think that, this lack of experience breeds in leadership, this idea that these are the folks that, can be trusted the least to work independently and do it well. I know, but that's just what and you look at what's happening now. Look at what's happening now. So right now, most of the B2B sales world is, if they're still employed, is doing work remote. I mean, can we be candid here? Is working remote, but there is still a resistance to distributed or remote sales teams. And I think that that's because of this perception that, folks in BDR, SDR roles are too young and immature to be able to do that job remote, which again, I'm mentioning just as an example of that lack of respect and how it's tied to perceptions about, some of it is age. And again, the other piece of it is maturity level. And then there's just, I think people take it for granted straight up, because it's people treat it a lot of the time as, work where you literally shut your brain off and just make these dials. And so they're like, well, that's not that hard. They're wrong, but it's those perceptions along with how folks who are now in leadership positions or, toward the middle of their career, how they were treated when they entered the profession, right? And this idea that, if I had to make 100 cold calls and get treated crappy, in order to get where I am, you can too. So it's just a combination of those factors that leads to this really unhealthy and frankly unsavory set of beliefs and ideas that are negative toward the SDR community and toward that role. Do you feel seen? Is that what you took a deep breath for? Tell me.
I want to go back to what you said there about you just kind of unconsciously make phone calls, right? Right. They told you what to do. You'd stand up, smile, and dial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just
That's right.
go through those. I remember once having one of my a marketing lady that worked for me, and she was like, watch what I can do. And she like banged out 150 phone calls in one day. But I don't think she got a single lead.
Oh no!
Because she'd worked for telemarketing, a company that did telemarketing for anyway. There's more to that, and you said that. What is that more? What is it? What is the thing? What's the value added that an SDR brings when they're on the phone?
Well, number one, like we talked about at the top, I'd say it's empathy. Number two, if they're doing it right, it's an understanding of the ideas and issues that drive the industry that they're selling into, which is broader than just the product that's being sold. I think that you could teach a bot to spit out features and benefits, but you couldn't teach a machine the kind of context that you can teach a BDR or an SDR that's going to be necessary, absolutely critical in making the kind of connection that's going to cause somebody to spend money with you. And so, this is why that perception that it's just phone calls is way off. I saw this early in my career, but again, the culture of what it means to be an ISR or BDR or SDR hadn't caught up to what I was experiencing. So I got my first job. It was actually a full cycle ISR at a SaaS company. And the expectation was 100 to 150 phone calls a day, right? In order to yield a certain amount of conversation. You know how it works, right? A certain amount of conversations, which will yield a certain amount of demos and a certain amount of sales. Whereas the young woman next to me had to make those 100 dials in order to meet her goal. I was hovering somewhere around 50 to 75 dials to meet that goal. And do you know the conversations that I was pulled in to have with leadership? The conversations I was pulled in to have were still, why aren't you making 100 to 150 calls? And I'm like, look, because of this, my ability to communicate nuance and context and an understanding of what people, actual humans are up against and experiencing, it doesn't take me as many dials to make what you've asked me to make happen in terms of results. And so then the conversation continued with the leader telling me, well, if you only have to make 50 calls to meet or exceed your goal, think about what you could do if you made 100 calls. And I got, I got sold on that. That worked on me. I was like, oh man, I guess I do have to make the 100 calls. But, reflecting back on that and in the work that I'm doing with SDR Defenders, I don't know about that. I think we shouldn't punish those who have this ability to provide context and nuance effectively, to understand, at an industry or community level, the folks that they're selling into. So that's the difference, and that's the disconnect. And I think that once we do the work as a larger sales culture of, incentivizing that behavior instead of, demonizing it and punishing it. And we stop placing such a premium on activity volume versus, placing a premium on relationships and the behaviors that drive results. I think that's how we turn a corner in this thing.
What do you think are the right KPIs, the key performance indicators that management should be looking at?
I love this question. I really think that when we're talking,
you do.
I think I've said that the last two questions. So you're knocking it out of the park here, Pat. No, I love meetings held as a metric for SDRs.
Yep.
Because I think that it's a really effective way to measure how well the SDR is communicating context. Because if they've done that right, if they've effectively communicated context and effectively built a connection, I don't just mean rapport where you ask them how the weather is where they live and make a joke. I mean, like really connecting with people and getting them to open up to you, what that does in increasing the likelihood that someone will show up. I can't even, I can't enumerate that. I can't even put that on paper. I'm sure it exists in somebody's Salesforce report, but look, the point is, that's the number one KPI that I would measure on. I'm not against a minimum dial requirement. But I would probably cut it in half if we're talking about 100, because I just don't know what that at the end of the day, I don't want folks focusing too much on that and not enough on why this person doesn't have to make that call volume. I do also like, and I don't know if it's necessarily a KPI, but definitely something to include in a bonus structure. I like, after a customer is onboarded that an SDR sourced, I like, looking at retention or incentivizing that in some way for an SDR so that they're completely as invested as possible in not just, setting appointments, but in creating happy customers that last. I think that too often organizations wait until an account gets to CS or to customer support, to customer success, or gets to account management,
right,
to start to really emphasize that, when in fact, if you did it right, your SDR probably, created some magical connection. I know I have. That's the fun part of the job. They created some magical foundation. They delighted that buyer enough to make them do what a complete stranger said and show up for this meeting. Why abandon all of that capital? Why abandon all that you built? So I guess I'd look at ways that, have teams collaborating on, at least in spirit, on what it takes, to be successful throughout the journey from prospect to happy customer to advocate, versus just those typical KPIs that have SDRs laser focused on, how many dials they make.
I agree. It's this whole idea, right? It actually goes back to the Deming thing, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
That's right.
But what if you're measuring the wrong things? And that's why it's so important that you're focusing, that you're trying to get people to work with intent. I love the idea that maybe the SDRs would actually get paid when the deal gets closed. So they're going to want to work with the account executive as best as they can and say, you really need to work with this guy. You do that extra phone call, or that actually maybe even that little bit of coaching, like, how's that deal coming along? That would make, I think, for a truly collaborative team effort.
Right. And more than that, more than the collaborative team effort, the result of that, because people feel that when they work with you, the result of that in terms of not just how long your buyers or customers stay with you, but how enthusiastic they are about staying with you, how tough it is for your competitors to break in and be a wedge in your relationship. And I think so many bright, young SDRs that I work with and seasoned ones,
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that is really setting those folks apart. There are folks who, the buyer remembers their first conversation with the SDR and that connection that they made just as much, if not more, than the experience they had with the AE in the more nuts and bolts part of the buying process. And I think that that's important. I think that that's in a way that they may not be able to appreciate yet. That's really what's driving a lot of startups, especially, but a lot of SaaS organizations today. But I want to talk about something that you mentioned in terms of like what it looks like when we get this part wrong. When we incentivize the wrong things, that is, right? When we look at the wrong KPIs and behaviors. So when we're looking at volume and when we're looking at, just appointments set, right, versus appointments held. If those are the behaviors that we are incentivizing, or at least the behaviors that we're tracking and communicating about them, give the most feedback around to the SDR team, then we can't be surprised or upset when we see these LinkedIn posts that are calling out, terrible emails that an executive received, or terrible cold calls that executive received, right? Those things happen when it's not the SDR's fault. It's the SDR doing what they were incentivized to do. It's the SDR doing what they were trained to do. And it affects, again, overall sales culture, perception of salespeople from folks who aren't in the role in a really negative way. It's not an easy fix, but the writing is certainly on the wall that it's a simple mindset tweak, a simple tweak in what we're incentivizing in terms of behavior, to get us where we need to go.
You get robocalls, right?
Yes.
I just got one like 2 hours ago for an alarm system. That guy calls me every 3 weeks. This is the last call, he says. It never is. So, this is not what we want from human beings. It is a very competitive market out there. We have more choices than we've ever had in the past. And in fact, it's almost too many choices, and buyers get in a situation where it's practically impossible for them to choose, and they very often don't. So the status quo is like your biggest competition. What advice do you have for SDRs? Let's move to tactics here. What kinds of things can they do to not sound like a robocall? What kinds of things did you find worked for you to make a quick connection with a human being?
I think for me, tone and cadence, and making sure that first question that I ask is as relevant and personalized as possible, got my foot in the door more often than not. So, and I know that, when folks think of tactics, they want, me to regurgitate a HubSpot article about, 3 ways to start a conversation on a cold call that will 10x your quota, or whatever that is, right? And I don't know, I'm not picking on HubSpot. I love HubSpot. They're great resources. But what I mean to say, we've seen this, right? And for me, it's simpler than that. It's more human even than that. And this push to see what we can systematize and see what we can hack and manipulate is part of the problem. So I'm not going to give you, if you say these things, you will win. But if you say something relevant in a way that sounds or that is sincere, you'll lose less. So for me, it was creating curiosity in my tone, right? And knowing when to balance that out with, creating authority in my tone if I was talking about the product itself and wanting to sound, like I had wanting to communicate expertise. But those are the types of things that worked for me. it's in terms of getting into phone calls. When I talk about being relevant, I don't mean it in this buzzy way where people are just kind of throwing it out there and leaving you to the wolves to figure out what that means for you. I do have something of a tactic when it comes to that. One of my favorite sources to find quick context on a person beyond their LinkedIn page, if I'm going to make a phone call, is Twitter. People tend to hold back a lot less on Twitter. And I'm not suggesting that you go to your prospect's Twitter and
true. I do.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
I do. And see, in my Twitter, I'm still very conscious of the impression I'm making. But even within that, on my Twitter is a lot more freewheeling than my LinkedIn. So even if what you find on this prospect's or this buyer's Twitter isn't something that you're going to directly reference in the conversation, just having that foundational knowledge that, hey man, this is a human being who is also a fan of the San Francisco Giants that I don't need to be afraid of, can go a long way. And then as you get farther into the conversation, there may be the opportunity to have something, find that piece of commonality that, gets them to see you differently from the way that they've seen the last 10 people that have given them a call. And so, the long and short of what I'm getting at is to rely less on tactics. I don't even too much like the word, and honestly, because there's a connotation for me of tactic that is negative, that is manipulative, right? And there needs to be strategy, there needs to be process. But I believe in building that strategy and process around how to make the quickest human connection versus around how to more quickly get to the thing that I want, right? Like my selfish result, that is, right? And again, I know this sounds like common sense, but if you watch the way people are just now starting to talk about being more human and being empathetic in the spaces where salespeople have these conversations, you'll find that it's being treated with a certain level of novelty, which indicates to me that it must not have been as widely spread a tool, as widely spread an approach. So, that is my sincere advice. If you're starting out, or again, if you're trying to improve, to just really, as much as you possibly can, make strategy and process around how to cut through to what is human.
Excellent. Very good. Nikki, if people want to find you online, where would they go to do that?
I am ubiquitous. No, I think I live on LinkedIn. And so that's probably the quickest way to find me personally. Also, a lot of the content that I'm producing in collaboration with the other SDR Defenders is on the SDRDefenders.com website. You can go there to find me and the rest of the Defenders, or to submit content to be featured. And I've also just yesterday, I launched a Bravado community called BDR Breakthrough. And so you can look for BDR Breakthrough on Bravado, and I'll be there too.
I'll link those in the show notes.
Oh,
so that
also, I'm sorry, on Twitter at Nikki Ivey, and Instagram at the same handle. And it's not no as in like do not. No as in knowledge. So KNOW Nikki Nikki Ivey. No Nikki.
And that's the unadulterated you, unlike the LinkedIn, which is the adulterated you.
Right. I mean, look,
for sure, we gotta go to Twitter.
I keep it clean on Twitter, but you might catch. So my husband's a DJ, so you might catch a video on Twitter of my husband and I in our sunroom with him playing loud rap music and me dancing to it and hyping him up. That you won't find on LinkedIn.
I can't wait to go look for that right now. I'm going to put that link in. In fact, maybe I'll link some tweets so that people can see.
So
funny. This has been fun. Nikki.
I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. I have to tell you, so I do a few podcasts. One very recently that I have done, I was on, it was where there was video, and the podcaster, the interviewer, was just looking at the stuff I have in the background, and he asked me about something that I had on my bookshelf, and I go, well, it's a CD of Alice in Chains MTV Unplugged. And then I hear the interviewer, this kid is about like 25 years old. He's typing like really fast. And I'm like, wait, are you Googling Alice in Chains? And then he just was like, no, I know who she is. I was like, oh, this interview's over. Anyway.
I have a Chains CD actually from like 25 years ago. How long ago was that? That's a long time ago. It was like...
So since that didn't happen, I think you're doing a bang up job. I've enjoyed myself.
Yeah. Well, you're interesting. I could have asked you a whole lot more questions.
Well, I guess I just got to come
back.
This
is good stuff. Maybe you'll have to come back. Nikki, thank you for...
That's how we solve that.
Thank you for babbling here on Sales Babble. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me, Pat.
Sales Babble is sponsored by Habanero Media, a podcasting agency for B2B brands. Podcasting is the easiest way to turn your executives into thought leaders with content that reaches your ideal clients. Haven't you heard that podcasting is the new blogging? Start a podcast today. Go to habaneromedia.net. That's habanero with an H, like the hot pepper. It's a hot idea. Go to habaneromedia.net and start podcasting today. I have immense respect for SDRs. They've got a demanding job. It's the foundation of any sales organization. Anything I can do to support them on this podcast, sign me up. That's why I'm excited to share that I'll be interviewing other members of the SDR Defenders in the future. I really want to keep this conversation going. Now, to find links to Nikki and the SDR Defenders, you can go to www.salesbabble.com/322 for the show notes. Like I said, I want to make this short this week. Don't forget to join us for the Thursday Telebabble teleconference. That's where you can join in and meet other Sales Babble listeners. This is a teleconference call, only the phone, so you can do two things at once and at the same time meet other sales reps. You know, sales is a lonely profession. Here's a chance for you to build your network. This week, we'll be talking about prospecting and business development. Again, that's Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock Chicago time. You can do the calculation for your time zone. Until then, take care and have a highly successful and profitable selling day.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Babble podcast. Find us at www.salesbabble.com.
This is a production of Habanero Media.